Good afternoon, you wee bastards, and welcome back to War Thunder with Koala. So, this video is going to be a rather interesting one. What we're going to do is go over the new radar tracking mechanics that were added in Update 1.87 Locked On, for both top-tier anti-air vehicles like this, the ZPR K2S6 Tunguska, as well as top-tier jets like the Mitsubishi T2 and some earlier tier props. We've got a bunch of new controls and some whizzy things on top of our top-tier SPAA. How do they work? Let's get into it. So lads, the first thing we need to do is set up the new controls we're going to use to start using the radar. Now, they're set up separately for both aircraft and tanks, which is good because, well, you're going to have mapped your keys quite differently for aircraft controls as for ground vehicles. So it's nice to be able to use some different keybinds and not have the radar controls interfere with your existing control setup, because you've bound them for tank battles, not realizing that you've already used those keys for some of your aircraft controls. The only issue this creates is that the game will ask you if you want to bind controls for ground vehicles radar to some keys already being used when those keys are in use for aircraft that you're obviously not going to have to worry about, which seems to me like some unfinished modelling on Gaijin's part, but let's pay it no mind for now. Just click on Add to bind the controls for ground vehicles radar and don't worry about those keys interfering with aircraft controls. Now, the radar controls for both aircraft and tanks will be found under their respective tabs at the bottom of the weaponry section. Bit of a strange place for them. Once again, this could be something that Gaijin hasn't got around to implementing properly yet, so if you're watching this video in a future where these things have been changed, obviously they might be in a different spot. So the controls are the same for SPAA and jets. There are 7 different controls currently, but you won't need to bind all of them. The first one you'll see is the radar on-off key, which is pretty simple. For ground vehicles it defaults to on, and for aircraft it will begin in the off position. So just hit the key to toggle it. If you want to lower the spinning dish on your SPAA to get a lower profile and hide, or in the future if we get anti-radar locking missiles you want to hide from, and for aircraft I honestly don't see a reason you should ever turn this off. Now, the second keybind here is one that had me, and I know a lot of other players, confused. This is the change radar mode, which currently in-game does absolutely nothing for aircraft or tanks. I don't know what it is meant to do or may do in future, but of course in time we may see vehicles that have a more advanced radar and do use this keybind for something. Do keep that in mind. Of course, if I'm mistaken and there is a use for this key that I have not discovered, then do let me know in the comments, but it's not something you'll need to worry about for now. The next key down is the change radar search mode key, which only works on a couple of vehicles. What this does is change the field of view of the radar, and to be perfectly honest with you, I find this to be of zero use in ground battles. I believe the only vehicle that even has the ability to change its FOV is the ZSU-23 Force Shilka, and as you can see, we can switch between a narrow, I believe it's a 60-degree sweep, a very slow 360 degrees, and a completely stationary radar. My advice would be for this particular vehicle, keep it on the 60 degree and just sweep your turret around to look for aircraft if you think there might be some off to the far left or right of you or behind you. Generally, I find that if you're spawning in a Shilka, you probably know where the enemy aircraft or helicopters are, and they're most likely going to be in front of you anyway, so I don't really see this getting used much, if at all, but if you think you will get some use out of it, especially if you play tanks in simulator mode and you want to use the Shilka there, go ahead and bind it to whatever key you find most convenient. As you can see, I have all my radar keys for ground vehicles bound on the number pad, specifically the lowest line. I also use the numpads plus, minus and enter keys for adjusting range, plus to increase, enter to decrease, and the smaller minus key to reset. Now, in aircraft with more advanced radar like the Mitsubishi T2, the change radar search mode button switches the radar sweep from a 180 degree arc to a narrower 60 degree arc. The use of this is to allow for faster cycling in order to ping targets more frequently, but once again I don't really see this as being something that will come in especially handy in realistic mode, where the 180 degree sweep is generally fast enough that you can keep targets in sight. However, in future when we get jets like the MiG-23 or F-105 Thunderchief that are capable of well over Mach 2, this may be more useful for retaining a fix on their position. Other jets like the MiG-19 PT, as well as the various prop aircraft with radars like the P-61 Black Widow or Heinkel 219 do not have the ability to use this, as they have a much older and simpler type of radar. The next keybind down is named Change Radar Scope Scale. This one is very simple. All it does is change the range of the radar, which you can see next to the indicator. Each time you hit the key, you'll cycle upward through the ranges, up to a whopping 370 kilometers for something like the T2 or British Javelin, which means it can literally detect aircraft across the map on any air map currently in game, including simulator maps. If this seems like a wee bit of overkill, that's because it is. On the ground, you'll notice that at the furthest range, the highlighted sector does not always extend all the way out to the outer edge of the radar detection circle. This is the maximum range at which targets can be locked, although keep in mind that you won't be able to fire at them at these distances anyway or get a lead indicator. Now we start getting into the fun stuff, which is the radar locking and target tracking. The select radar target to lock on key will cycle between targets detected on the radar so long as they're within the highlighted arc, which is mainly useful if you want to switch targets, as sometimes the radar locking mechanic can prioritize targets in a really strange order. It can also be useful in air battles, as the radar on your aircraft will not distinguish between friend and foe, so sometimes you'll hit the locking key, which we'll go over next, and the radar will lock onto an ally. Make sure to have this bound so that you can switch targets quickly if need be. As you can see, I have it bound to number 2 on the numpad. Remember that this key will not auto-rotate your turret or give you a lead indicator. That comes next. Arguably the most important control of them all is the lock radar target on key, so make sure you map this one to a key that's easy to hit at a moment's notice. What this does is lock whichever target is selected on the radar, although keep in mind that in some SPAAGs as well as all aircraft, the cursor has to be directly on the target to lock it. This can make it somewhat difficult to use in aircraft, as in certain situations, pointing the cursor directly at an enemy you are approaching at 1,000 km an hour will make it impossible to then put your nose at the lead indicator circle and fire accurately before overshooting your target. With this in mind, remember to lock targets as soon as possible, and you'll be able to tell when they're in locking range when the blip on the radar screen is within the darker highlighted wedge closest to the origin. This is the one time you might want to set the radar search mode to the faster cycling 60-degree scope so that you can see immediately when that aircraft falls within locking range. I personally just try to remember distance, as I find that staring at the radar instead of watching where I'm flying can mean that I miss the enemy performing certain maneuvers, and in aircraft like the T2 or Javelin that do not maneuver very well, this can be the difference between snagging a kill or letting one get away. In your SPAA, this key basically turns you into an inescapable death machine, as not only do you get an extremely accurate lead indicator, but your turret will also automatically traverse to follow the tracked target. That means that all the player has to do once the target is locked is put the crosshair on that little green circle, which it will continue to follow, fire, and if that aircraft doesn't pull any hard Gs between then and your rounds reaching that distance, he is guaranteed to get hit. And people legitimately asked for these mechanics to be simplified. What's worth keeping in mind is that the American Vulcan or VADS and Italian Sidam 25 must be in the scope view in order to lock a target, while on the other hand, other SPAAGs like the German Gepard, British Chieftain Marksman or Russian Tunguska actually just have to have the target selected within the highlighted sector, press the lock key while the radar sweeps over it, and the turret will automatically swing around to face the target and begin auto-leading. When firing the Tunguska's surface-to-air missiles, what you want to do is put the cursor somewhere in front of the target's trajectory, not necessarily on the lead indicator. Press whichever key you have bound to fire your missile, and adjust the crosshair's position as necessary, keeping the missile itself directly between you and the target at all times. Because the turret will auto-traverse to keep the target in the same position on the scope, this should result in a good hit, and even some hard maneuvers will not be enough to save enemies given the proximity fuse of these missiles. One trick that you can also use is to purposely fire your missiles at an angle away from your target so that the smoke trail doesn't obscure your vision, which can be especially useful against far-range helicopters. The seventh and final key of the bunch is the Switch Radar Indicator type key. Now, this is a keybind which you should not really worry about because what it changes is purely aesthetic. Functionally, this setting does nothing. What this key does is change the way the radar data is displayed, switching from a circle or semicircle shape to a square, which I've been told is more akin to the displays in more modern aircraft. Angle or direction to the target is then displayed on the X-axis, while distance is displayed separately on the Y. The radar will then cycle across the screen, bouncing back and forth for aircraft just as it does when using the default radar type. This setting, however, can make some of the data more difficult to decipher. For example, this target here is currently behind me, even though it is in the direct center of my radar screen, because the ground-based radar does a full 360-degree sweep and will always orientate north. What you've got to understand is that this setting does not change any of the information coming from the radar, merely the way in which it is displayed. The search mode and scope are still the same, the locking range and dead zones are the same, and do not be tricked into thinking that with the alternate radar type, you'll you'll be able to see targets that are further out this way than you can with the default type. It doesn't work like that. What it does is stretch the origin out to fill the whole bottom of the screen while displaying the entire circle in front of the origin in a square shape rather than pivoting around it. As such, the edges of the screen are actually what is directly behind me rather than to my sides, and targets in closer proximity to the radar origin will display lower on the radar screen rather than closer to its center. In aircraft, this is the same, although keep in mind that only the segment of the circle detectable by the radar sweep is shown, so this whole line is what is directly to my sides, while in something like the MiG-19 PT, which only has a 120-degree detection sector, this is still in front of me, off to my 10 o'clock. When on the ground, I definitely prefer to use the default radar type with the circular display, but in aircraft where the radar sweep only covers the forward arc anyway, I feel that the alternate display type can actually be more precise and informative, separating the distance and direction into the two axes. I would definitely advise, however, that you first get used to the default type, play around with it, certainly try at least one night battle using it just to get a feel for how and when it can be most useful and how information is displayed on it, before switching over to the alternate display and seeing in test flights and custom battles whether or not you prefer having the information displayed in this way before trying it out in a real battle. One thing I haven't mentioned is that for aircraft radar, the sweep will always be horizontal to the orientation of the aircraft itself. What this means is that it will not display altitude, simply direction and distance on the two-dimensional plane. It also has basically no negative reticle view, meaning that while it can detect aircraft several thousand feet above you, it will not be able to detect anything more than a couple hundred feet below you, unless you angle your nose downwards. What you can do to calculate a target's altitude is roll your aircraft 90 degrees, meaning that your left and right becomes up and down. This way, how far to your side a target is will tell you what altitude they are at compared to you. If the target still displays as being directly in front, then it's at your altitude. But if, such as in this circumstance, the aircraft displays as being to my left. Now, my left currently is up in the sky, so an aircraft that is off my left wing must therefore be at a higher altitude than me, and given how far to the left he is, I can gauge how much higher than me that target is, while still looking at how high that blip is on the radar screen to work out the target's distance from me horizontally. It's a rather advanced way of using the radar that only really works well when using the alternative indicator type, and since you obviously can't roll your Tunguska over, if you do then you're a terrible driver, you can only use this technique in aircraft, and it's only really relevant to aircraft as well, just because of how the game itself works. Finally, here is my suggestion for the rebalancing of SPAA within the battle ratings thanks to this new factor that makes some more powerful than others. The American VADS is definitely the worst of the bunch and can stay at 8.0. Now please keep in mind that, as I've said many times before, I think that tank battle ratings should be spaced out, decompressed a lot, and so an 8.0 tank might be something like the M46 Patton or IS-3. In that case, literally every battle rating would have to be played around with, but I think 8.0 is fair for the VADS right now. The Italian Sidam 25 and Soviet ZSU 23 for Shilka should both sit one step above that at 8.3, and at 8.7 the British Chieftain Marksman, which has almost no dead zone and potentially one of the best locking mechanisms besides the Tunguska, but is the slowest SPAAG of the bunch and cannot track or even detect other targets while locked on, which is a big hamper to its effectiveness and something I do see getting it killed. Next up would be the French AMX-30 DCA at 9.0, which has a very good rate of fire on a nimble chassis, but has a rather large dead zone above it, although a very good locking mechanism like the British SPAA. At 9.3 comes the German Gepard and its weeb clone, the Japanese Type 87. Now, I don't have the Type 87 myself, so I'm not sure of its range or its dead zone, but potentially if the dead zone is bad, it could be 9.0 alongside the AMX. Considering that it really is a clone of the Gepard, I'm just going with that and putting it in the same spot. What would also come at 9.3 is the American M247 Sergeant York, which does have a godlike rate of fire and air-bursting 40mm rounds, but its dead zone is just disgustingly big and it's a massive and not exactly very speedy target, so I think it'd be balanced here. The Italian Automatic would then be moved up a spot to 9.7, but honestly this thing could be 10.0, and the 2S6 Tunguska, the main pain for your plane game, would move up to a battle rating of 10.3, when undoubtedly the tier 7 tanks like the M1A1, Leopard 2A5, T-80U and hopefully not the Challenger 2, but I can see it happening, get moved up there as well. Seriously, the Tunguska is basically inescapable if the player using it knows even remotely what they're doing, and should probably be fighting against aircraft like the F-14 Tomcat, not the F-100D Super Sabres and FJ-4 Furies it stomps on currently. Obviously more missile-equipped anti-air vehicles are on the way, and my personal opinion is that something like the American M6 Linebacker or German Gepard with 4 AIM-92 Stinger infrared air-to-air missiles would honestly work at the same battle rating as the Tunguska, because although the Tunguska has to manually guide its missiles while Stingers are fire and forget, that does mean that the Russian vehicle can adjust the missile's course as need be, and they can actually pull more Gs, I believe, while you can also fire them without lock and even kill tanks with them, which is something I see people doing a lot. It's one of the reasons the Tunguska is so good. As for rebalancing aircraft, most of them are fine where they are. The T2 is obviously a wee bit overpowered, and the F3D Skyknight, surprisingly enough, is also quite insanely powerful right now, and could easily be moved up to a battle rating of, let's say, 8.0, even 8.3 if it gets given the AIM-7 Sparrow semi-active radar-guided air-to-air missiles. We'll just have to wait and see what Gaijin has in store for us in the future. Anyway lads, that is going to be all for this video. I hope you have enjoyed, found it informative, and that this guide helps you out with using the new radar mechanics and getting the most out of them. I'm going to be doing a video tomorrow on how to combat these radar-equipped vehicles, talking about some of the exploitable weaknesses they have, and teaching you guys how to break lock, so definitely come back for that, and let me know your thoughts on my suggested rebalancing of SPAA battle ratings at top tier. I'd love to get into some civil discussion with you lads. If this video did help you out, please be sure to hit that like button and share the video around to help me out in return, subscribe to the channel and click on that bell icon, join the 360 squad, and remember to come follow me at all these social media, links are in the video description below. If you'd like to support my channel further, there is also a link down there to my Patreon, and guys, every little bit goes a long way. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. It turned out a wee bit longer than I expected. Enjoy the new radar mechanics, go explore just what they're capable of, and always remember lads, keep your bagpipes close at hand, keep your kilt firmly on, and I shall see you next video. I say a wee thank you to these lads for supporting me on Patreon. The Bretlander, Seagull Nuts, DA261, Latvian Wolf, Gisli Arsen, and Dark Recon. You lads are bra. If you wish to join them, come check out the link in the description below.